The question of today's and future role played by the European Union on the international scene is the same question as a question about the future perspectives of being a superpower. If European Union could be one of the most important political forces in the world in the future, or maybe even the dominant one. If the European Union is to be the European hegemon and superpower of the world in the 21st century, we should already be able to spot some traces of this future hegemony. So there are many opinions about the future role played, the role that European Union will play as a whole on the international scene in the future. The biggest Euro optimist, I think, is Mark Leonard, the British politologist, the author of a very interesting book, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, published in 2005, who thinks that the European Union will take the America's place as the dominant superpower. In his opinion, the European Union seems a little bit dormant, because we are usually observing the European Union from the American perspective. When we are considering the American hard force as something that is obvious, then the soft force used by the European diplomats seems something like a weakness to us. Contrary to that assumption, Leonard thinks that the European approach is a better one, because it ensures the European influence in the world without antagonizing the other countries, whereas the Americans are usually antagonizing them. In his book about China, in his other book, Leonard of course observes the rise of China and thinks it's permanent. He thinks that China's rise is permanent. That's a different perspective than, for instance, the perspective of Robin Meredith or Guy Sorman, that usually emphasize the economic dependence of China from the West. The funny thing is that this book of Leonard about how the European Union will dominate in the world in the 20th century is not published in Poland. This book about China was published in Poland, and this is a signal that in Poland there are not enough Euro enthusiasts to get this book published. We usually publish books that suggest the failure of the whole European concept. Slightly different opinion about the future has Farid Zakaria, the Indian-born American politologist, who thinks that the major superpower in the world in the 20th century still be USA, but doesn't think that USA will be the absolute hegemon. He usually thinks that there will be a multilateral world, and the American position will be only slightly better than of the other powers, like France or Britain or United Europe, of China, India, Japan, Russia, and so on. He emphasizes that those powers are growing more and more independent from American judgment, for instance. In Huntington's vision, we have this conservative appraisal of the Asian values, which are usually contrary to the individualistic liberal virtues that triumph in the West. And this triumph is, of course, very much criticized by the conservatives, and that's why they seek the Confucian guidance sometimes in China or Japan, and try to emphasize some so-called Asian integrity in contrast to the European decadence or something. But of course we have here the much ideologized vision of the conservative thinker here. We also have a very American visions of the future, and one of the authors that profits total failure of the European concept is Walter Laqueur. He is an refugee from the Nazi Wrocław to the United States during before the World War II, and he depicts a vision of a future Europe as something like a huge museum that has many guests from outside world to admire the traces of European former glory, but in his vision Europe has in future no real political influence in the world. Laqueur is think that the main indicator of this lack of internal European strength would be the problems with the for instance the striking audacious architecture. Usually this is a problem of many Americans, because the Americans usually see Europe as a big museum because there are no skyscrapers and so on. They often forget that the grounds in Europe are such that that would be a problem to construct the skyscrapers here. But this contrast between Europe, where there are only small islands of skyscrapers and buildings like that, like in Frankfurt in Germany, or in La Défense in Paris, or I don't know, in London, maybe City of London, and the contrast between that and the Pudong in Shanghai, or this high architecture of Hong Kong or Los Angeles or Manhattan, of course. This is usually seen as something like a European weakness, whereas we couldn't say that the Europeans are first. They very often have already the infrastructure inherited from I don't know, 19th century, and they very often simply don't need to construct skyscrapers to organize a bureau or some company or offices or something like that. Whereas in China they usually have to create the whole districts of city because of the big changes, because of including China to the world market. and America, because of the high prices of land on Manhattan, they have to build these skyscrapers and so on. But it's not only architecture. Lacan suggests that Europe has problem with demography, has problem with the hedonistic way of life, has problem with this reluctance to having children. So one cannot be sure if these arguments can really be treated as like these arguments about the illegal and legal and illegal immigrants from Maghreb and Muslim states and so on. They can then immigrants that cannot really adapt to the conditions of living in European states. We cannot really say if these arguments are really serious because these are very typical arguments used by conservatives throughout the world, that the Europe is falling because there are less children and so on, and the family is under attack, so family is in crisis. But there are many observations that would contradict such American a conservative perspective. For instance, in very much secularized France or Sweden, the demographics looks better than in Poland or Spain, so in the traditionally Catholic societies. Or the contraception pill is very rarely used in the Catholic south of Europe, although it's Spain and Italy that have the worst demographic score. Lacan predicts that Europe will be dominated in the future by Arabs and Muslims and so on. Whereas, for instance, Farid Zakaria says that also the European Muslims have this very strong tendency of having less and less children. So this share of Muslims within the European societies will be most probably stable, will reach about 8-9% of the whole European population and stop, and then stop, because the demographics of and the whole tendency about procreation and family planning will be very similar among the Christian secular majority and the Muslim minorities. And the same would most probably be true as far as the Hindus, of course, are concerned as well, and the Chinese in Europe. The same could have been observed in the 19th century when the Irish and the Italians invaded the Americans, invaded the United States, for instance, and these families, Irish and Italian families, were very much bigger than average American, that is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant family of that time. But after some decades, this gap became smaller and smaller. The same will probably happen, thinks Zakaria, in relation to the Muslim minorities in Europe. The Muslims living in Europe now sees that an education and bringing up children in Europe is an expensive business, and that's why this is the most probable. This is probably the most the best explanation of this of this tendency of Muslims to have not as many children as their fathers and mothers had. Farid Zakaria thinks that as far as demography is concerned, Japan and China will have bigger problems in the future than the European Union, because they have really no source to take immigrants from. This especially relates to Japan, that has real problems to accept as Japanese citizens even the Koreans that are living in Japan and who cannot speak Korean no more. They only speak Japanese, but they are still not treated as equals in Japan. The same is situation we can observe in relation to the Brazilian immigrants in Japan, who are in fact descendants of Japanese immigrants in Brazil. That usually, and they are usually, when it comes to as far as blood is concerned, they are purely Japanese, but they are brought up Brazilians, and the teachers, for instance, are complaining in Japan about their striking, audacious, and individualism, which is not so much accepted in Japanese society. 2 decades ago, it was really normal in Japanese schools to cope with this fancy individualism, but of these Japanese Brazilians. But now they usually let them live as they wanted. We can perceive anyway some rise of individuals in Japanese society, for instance this movement of the fritters and so on. But let us go back to the perspective of Europe being a superpower in the 21st century. We have of course the authors like Leonard, we have also for instance we have a German politologist, Michael Hufner, who is also of an opinion that Europe has a very big chance to be a superpower in the 21st century, because Europe has European politicians has this and leaders has this tendency of thinking many years ahead about things. Of course, Walter Laqueur is questioning this and thinks that it's simply not true. But still, we have this argument. Usually, it's an argument between the soft power and of the European Union and the hard power used mainly by the United States. The policy of the international politics that consist in playing a role of the world policeman. And of course, Robert Kagan and the conservative American thinkers usually think that soft power is another signal of European weakness, whereas the liberal thinkers usually have more sympathy to the European approach. So we have different opinions about the China, about Russia, European Union, and America in the 21st century. We have also different opinions. I can mention 2 opinions about Russia. For instance, Edward Lucas is convinced that Russia is rebuilding its power and uses the Russian resources as a base of the political weapon. And in Edward Lucas' opinion, Russia is succeeding in this. Edward Lucas' vision of the last decades of Russia's history is that after trying to introduce liberal and democratic reforms by Boris Yeltsin, the Russia changed their course again and returned to the old policy in similar to those led by Tsars and communist regime. That is to blackmail all the world to get what they want, and blackmail with their weapons and their resources and their monopoly, as far as many resources are concerned. And Lucas' vision about Russia is very similar to that of Sorman. Very similar to Sorman's vision of China, that Russia may be relatively weak at the moment, but after some decades of this blackmail, it can get more powerful, and then it would be very hard to stop her from doing what these countries' elites want to do, because this blackmail will make them rich and powerful, and even independent from the prices of resources. For instance, Polish politologist Tadeusz Kisielewski, that shares a very strict Lucas's very strict criticism towards Russia and its policy and international politics, think that Russia is politically dead and can afford its own imperialistic aims. And Kisielewski is predicting that Russia politically will fall and will become a second-rate country in a few decades. There is very often said that the European budget is too big, and the budget of the European Union is too big, and the whole administration is too overgrown to be effective. Although the independent voices like that of the journalists from the Economist, for instance, they usually sometimes inform us that European Union is has in fact too small budget to deal with all these aims written down in European statutes. So, for instance, the Austrian novelist Robert Menasse planned to write a new Kafka-like story about the overgrown and insensitive European bureaucracy, and he went to Brussels and observed for some time how this European administration works, and came to the conclusion that this bureaucracy is not at all overgrown, that it's quite a modest one, that it's smaller even than the administration of the city of Vienna, so by no means overgrown, rather very small, and very, very effective. It's very effective considering the small size of it. And he stated that this European administration is very similar to the enlightened administration of the times of Joseph II, Joseph II, Emperor of Austria at the end of the 18th century. Menasse has warned Europeans from this nationalistic tendencies to limit everything that is arranged at a European level. He thinks that nationalism is a very big threat to the European concept, and he's tried to convince his readers that it's the nation states that are something abstract and not the European Union. He was complaining that most Europeans sees European Union as something very artificial and not natural, and in the same time they perceive nations as something very natural. And he thinks that it should be seen totally differently, both of them. That the nations are this very artificial concept because the nations don't really exist. But the European Union, on the other hand, is a very concrete and visible institution that can be criticized because we know what it is. Because the European Union is something, and what nations are, it's very hard to define. Menasse is of an opinion that if the Eurozone should fall, then the all nationalistic demons would be freed, and the very unpleasant way of doing international politics in Europe, this way known from the 19th century, that is the concert of the totally independent states and nationalistic nations, will be restored, and this is nothing to be cheered. We shouldn't rejoice for such a scenario because it would make Europe as a whole weaker. Whereas Menasse thinks that the Eurozone, if the Eurozone fails, then the nationalistic demons will be freed. For instance, the Dutch historian Gert Mak thinks that if the European Union falls, then the several smaller unions would be established instead. So he thinks that Europe will never turn back to the real independent state because the global economy is already understood that in the conditions of global economy, it's understood that it's better to play in teams. As far as diplomacy, international diplomacy is concerned, the European Union for sure is playing below its power. It was up to recently, it was arguable if there was really something like the European foreign policy, but in the 80s already emerged in the experts' opinion, already in the 1980s, something like the common European foreign policy really emerged. Whereas in 1960s, France, who proposed to construct and to establish the European Union was a little bit getting back to their French national policy. In 1985, there was already much talk about the foreign policy of the whole European community, and it was clearly stated that this foreign European policy shouldn't be something like a combination of the foreign policies by all these member states, but something bigger than that, that should base on some common vision of the international politics, the European vision. For instance, the British, who tried for many decades to stop the process of the unification of Europe, they decided to join the European course in the 90s with the Prime Minister John Major. So the treaty about the European Union of 1993 was able to be formed. According to this treaty about the European Union, and its one of its ingredients, the common foreign policy and defense policy, the European policy would be something like the ideologically very similar to the attitude towards the towards the international policy as already demonstrated by the USA and United Nations. It took several years before the common foreign policy of the European Union was to be really constructed. There were many problems with this. For instance, in relations to Russia, it's very much recommendable if the Union would speak with one voice, because then Russia has this because Russia treats the whole Europe more seriously than separate states. And one of the problems was that after the unification of Germany, German policy was no more Europe orientated than it was before. It was very typical for German politicians before the reunification of Germany, to present themselves at international conferences as Europeans, and it stopped with the pride of the United Nation of Germany restored in 1990. But European Union is an independent player already in the international politics. For instance, we can measure how independent it is with the scale of the misunderstandings between the European Union and the United States of America. For instance, the European Union is cooperating economically very closely with Canada since 1976, and sometimes European Union and Canada make common statements, like in 1996 when Canada and the European Union criticized the American embargo against Cuba. Americans punished Canada for that by imposing restrictions on Canadian companies operating in Cuba. Of course, USA wasn't able to punish Europe. So we can see that European Union is growing pretty independent from the American government. It's deplorable that European Union very rarely speaks with one voice in European-Russian relations. For instance, when it was a problem with the sanitary conditions of the Polish meat exported to Russia. Of course, it was not simply a sanitary question, but it was a politically motivated decision to block the Polish meat from being exported to Russia. Then Angela Merkel has stated that if Vladimir Putin has a problem with one of the member states of the European Union, he has problems with all European unions. Of course, then Putin caved. It's a rare example, but still an example of how much force European Union has when it's really united. Russia knows how powerful the European Union is economically, especially economically, is when really united. Then and because of that, Russians prefer to deal with separate European states and doing business with them in the bilateral talks. We can also perceive separate European approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's European Union is by no means an Israeli ally that supports everything or almost everything Israel does, but try to be something like play a more arbitrary and balanced role in this conflict, in relation to this conflict. Also, the politics towards Lebanon, it's very different from the American one. Also, the policy towards Iran is different. The American approach is to try to impose sanctions on Iran and to frighten the Iranian political elites so much that they would cooperate with the United States, whereas the Europeans are still talking very peacefully. The European relations with China are not based on some common ground of some European strategy towards China, but still some of the European states like France and Germany had until recently very good relations with China. Especially this is especially true in relation to Jacques Chirac's relations with China. But this has changed after the more pro-American oriented Nicolas Sarkozy became president of France, and this also has changed in relation to the whole Europe when China realized that it would be very harder than they expected to weaken the transatlantic defensive alliance and the connections between the United States and United Europe. Europe as a whole is a very powerful military complex, but still until recently it was normal for Europe to wait till America will deal with all the regional conflicts, and Europe had this very clear tendency not to get engaged in conflicts. It's also clear that the American military machine is far more modern than European one. For instance, the only bigger invention in the last decades, European inventions that the Americans bought from Europe, was the British fighters Harrier, because it was cheaper to buy the British plane than to develop their own project. Up to 2001, United States usually wanted Europe only to intervene militarily if NATO if NATO only in case if NATO wouldn't be able to do so. But after 9/11 everything has changed also in that matter, and now the United States have more flexible position about the European military independence and European military missions. United States has started to encourage them. In 1998, Tony Blair forced Jacques Chirac to accept the rule that the military forces of the combined military forces of the member states of the European Union shouldn't be used in the same purposes as the NATO forces are normally used for. So it resulted in underdevelopment of the common military strategy of the European Union, and preserved the state of separate strategies and military customs in various European states. So today we have only a small European corps that consists in about 100,000 soldiers, some naval forces and aircraft, but there is no standing European army. But nevertheless, Europe play still a bigger and bigger role also as a world policeman, secondary to that of the United States. There are of course problems with immigration and immigrants adapting to the European life, and this is something like a drawback in the European process of becoming a major power, diplomatic and military power in the world. But most of this example of Islamic violence on the street of Europe or something like that are usually based on economic grounds and not ideological grounds. For instance, the immigrant that has killed Theo van Gogh, that criticized the so-called Islamization of Holland, is was an example that of a Muslim who failed to adapt to the Western culture, failed in his attempts to get a good job and so on, and that's why he got interested in radical Islam. The good signal is in Europe is the resigning from the postmodernistic approach and multicultural policy in relations to the immigrants, because it was demonstrated already by Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Melanie Phillips in the Netherlands and in England, that the immigrants should not be treated as some communities, but so they should be treated as anyone else, and if any immigrant commits any crime or misdemeanor, shouldn't be excused because of his deplorable status or economic problems, but should be treated as anyone, as exactly as the local families that live in those countries for ages. The liberal individualistic approach towards any immigrant, and combined with the very transparent set of rules how to behave in the society, seems to be a better approach. This liberal individualistic approach exerted by the authorities in France and United States are based on the model of the French and American idea of patriotism that relates not to blood and tradition but mainly to values. There is a French creed which is similar to American creed. It's a set of republican virtues, and they are independent from blood and tradition of some particular individual. And there is no British or Dutch creed. On the contrary, the postmodernistic methods in schools force such form of education that every community should learn only about the culture of that community. So the gaps between those communities, between those culture within one society, are growing bigger and deeper, and this does not help the immigrants to adapt to the new conditions, but rather make this assimilation more difficult. If, for instance, the Arabs or Hindus or Pakistanis, Arabs or Pakistanis are learned about the Pakistani and Arab history at history lessons and not the history of Great Britain, for instance, it's very big probability that some imam from their native countries will pop in as a teacher and inseminate those impressionable heads of the students with some radical Islamic tendencies. So it's, I think, a positive sign that, for instance, Angela Merkel already has stated that multiculturalism was a failure. Maybe it would be mean that the governments are turning to the old liberal individual methods, which makes assimilation better in France and in United States. France is very often criticized for this prohibition of burqas and so on and so on, and there are really some struggling between police and the aggressive immigrants, maybe even more frequent in France and than in Britain or the Netherlands. But also the number of Arabs convinced to live according to the local rules is greater in France than in Britain and in the Netherlands, and the hatred for France among those immigrants is not as big as sometimes is in these multicultural countries. But it's still hard to say if the Europeans would have much more problems with Arabs and Hindus than the Americans have with Mexican immigrants, for instance, and Japanese have with their lack of immigrants. But we must remember that the vision of Euro-Arabia was produced by the xenophobic nationalistic right-wing parties in Europe, and it's used by their leaders to frighten the electors and not to start some more realistic, rational discussion about immigration. There are also some misunderstanding between the European Union and America about the importance of free time, for instance, of about the how the working week should look like or something like that. But these different cultural differences always existed, and it's very hard to tell if they will have something to say about the role played by the United States and Europe in the world of tomorrow. For instance, maybe the Mexican immigrants in America will change the way how Americans perceive work. That they, as the Europeans say very often, that the Americans live to work and the Europeans work to live. But we cannot deny that Europe combined, if it's preserved in this state of union, cannot not be a powerful factor in the world of tomorrow.